Well, thank you and good morning, everyone. I'd like to, first of all, thank the organizers of the conference, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and the Nikos Polontas and Transform for providing us this opportunity, and thank you for inviting us from Iceland. I'm accompanied with two comrades that spoke yesterday, and it's actually been on the agenda for a long time for me to visit Greece. When Iceland, of course, became a front runner in the global financial crisis and world famous for that part, but soon after the problems became more severe in Greece and Ireland and other countries. And I remember very well when the spokesman from those countries came out and said, well, yes, we have some problems, but we are not Iceland. We are not like Iceland. We are not melting down like Iceland. That is how famous we became as the canary in the coal mine, you can say. And yes, the crises were very extreme in Iceland. I will come better to that later. Just a few words about us, the Left Green Party in Iceland. We were established in 1999, so we are 15 years old. We came immediately into parliament with around 9% of the votes, and there have been ups and downs from those 9% up to 22% actually in the elections in the spring 2009, and then back down to 11 in 2013. And that's where we are for the moment. We are a party that unifies the radical left to the left of the Social Democrats. We are a green party, so we have the environmentalists with us. We are a feministic party, so we have the feminists, and we have the peace movement and those who are against NATO membership and fight for demilitarization. Does this sound a little bit similar to someone? Might be. And as I say, we have been relatively successful and definitely made a difference in Icelandic politics. When we came on the scene, there were many that said, well, yes, there may be a few of them, but it will always be a marginal party with no influence and only a few percentage. But that did not turn out to be the case. And actually, we have played a major role in Icelandic politics, not to mention with our government from 2009 to 2013. Well, to the topic of this panel, which I think is supposed to be how do we move towards a new economic model in times of capitalistic crisis. And obviously there are many lessons to be learned from comparing the troubled countries, be it Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Iceland. Although each country is different and we have to be careful in comparison, there are striking similarities, and we are victim, one way or the other, of the same problems. We are all victims of the globalized, deregulated markets, the speculative, risk, greed-driven neo-capitalism. We all fell victims to periods of indebted growth, and everyone was very happy and we had nice growth, but the problem was that it was highly indebted. We were borrowing money, and the households and the businesses, the municipalities were becoming more indebted. And finally, of course, infamously Europe fell victim to a ridiculous system of allowing cross-border banking to expand to no limits at the risk of the home country in many cases. So we had situations like in Iceland, Ireland, Cyprus, where banks had grown to 5 times, 7 times, even 10 times the size of the national economy, but that expanded operations overseas were largely the responsibility of the home country, provided that the businesses were carried out in branches. As it turned out for Iceland, there was a huge difference between cross-border banking, whether the operations overseas are in branches or in subsidiaries. If it is in subsidiaries, it's a totally different matter. Those are registered companies in the countries concerned, and they are responsibility of the supervision in that country, and the deposit guarantee scheme also responsible in that country. But if the banks are allowed to expand their operations overseas in branches, as was the case especially with one bank in Iceland, it is all supposed to be the responsibility of the home country. Even a tiny country like Iceland, with its own currency, its own supervisory system, and own deposit guarantee system, was supposed to stand good for the huge international operations. And of course we couldn't do that. So the banks failed, and there was no way we could have rescued them. Now this was all according to European regulations. We were not doing anything illegal. This is allowed under the directives of European cross-border banking in the market. Ridiculous system. Anyway, what do? We could discuss the whole day the problems and the routes to them, but probably the more interesting thing is, now that we are here, we have been faced with and dealing with this enormous crisis, with all its huge social and human costs, and where do we go from now on? Well, one thing is absolutely certain. The task is not to restore the same system. It can be. I don't think we have to discuss that. But be aware, as time goes on and things calm down or look a little bit better, there are forces there that want to do exactly that, to restore exactly the same system. And that is, I think, where the main line of defense lies. Very important, of course, is to do all possible to avoid socializing the losses. And it's very much about that. And I think we should use a simple argument here. Even the capitalists have to admit that you can't have it a private system. If you want private financial sector, it has to be private both ways. You can't constantly privatize the gains and socialize the losses. No one can argue for such a system. It is so outrageous that even the extreme right cannot say that is okay. So avoid socializing the losses as uttermost possible. In our experience, it turned out to be very important for Iceland that we, as a red government, left-wing government, said already in the very beginning, when we came to power in 1st of February 2009, we are a left-wing government, and we are going to defend the Icelandic Nordic-style welfare system throughout the crisis, no matter what. And we made this very clear to the IMF and to the international community. But we said at the same time, we are going to be responsible and tackle the problems, and we are going to deliver the necessary economic goals. And can you do both? Yes, you can do both. It's a matter of choice. We tried to shelter the low-income groups, the welfare structures, and it was a goal in itself to keep up the living standards of the lowest paid and pensionists and the weakest groups in society. With a very good argument, I think. Through that, you avoid marginalization of these groups. They remain active as consumers, and they contribute to economy instead of being marginalized and more or less inactive. And there's a huge difference for an economy in light of the chances of recovery, not to marginalize and deactivate big parts of the population. But this is what happens if you don't pay attention to the socio-economic factors. And the biggest mistakes of many of the austerity programs around us have been negligence of this. So what did we do? we taxed the high income groups. We introduced a 3-bracket private income tax system with a medium and a high bracket for the high income. And through this, we managed to shelter the lowest quarter entirely from any tax raises. They actually paid a little less because the private income tax was becoming very progressive. We introduced a wealth tax, so the richest families paid additionally. We doubled the financial gains tax. We introduced many green taxes, carbon, CO2 tariffs. We introduced tariffs on resource rent. Those who are allowed to use the common resources like the fisheries and so on should pay a little fee, resource fee to the owner of that resource, the people. And we raised taxes on tobacco, alcohol, benzene, diesel, what have you. I mean, there are very few things that we didn't raise the taxes on. But we also had to save expenditure. The problems in Iceland, the deficit became so huge, so enormous, 14% of GDP in 2008, that we were forced to do both, cut down and increase revenue. And there's also a very important political element involved when you are saving expenditure, because you can do that in many different ways. We also had a very progressive profile when it came to cuts. We cut 2 to 3 times more in general administration than we did in health and education. So we sheltered the welfare expenditure, but were actually very aggressive on cutting down the general administration and investments. So we chose what we called a mixed model. We had to do both. And we were also very aware of the threats of this extensive measures cooling the economy down and blocking growth, as our friend here was saying. That is, of course, one of the big problems. How do you do this without freeze down the economy? So we tried to stimulate and activate the economy with many measures on the sideline. But talking about stimulus, obviously, if you have a lot of money and if the state is not very indebted, it's tempting to try what the Slovenians did in the beginning before they took the U-turn, just to pump money into the economy with public investments and so on. But we could not afford that. But there are other ways to stimulate the economy. And what is it if you higher pensions, if you give tax reductions to the lowest income groups, and they get little more money? It's a stimulus. And it's probably the most effective and best way to stimulate an economy in crisis is to support the lower income groups so that they remain active and contribute to, among other things, growth. So what is striking with Iceland, and this is not something I'm saying, you can read the latest OECD report, which came out early this week. And among other things, they are publishing the new Gini coefficient for the OECD countries, built on the numbers for 2010. And Iceland has regained its seat at the top of the list, number 1, with the lowest Gini coefficient of all the OECD countries, 0.24. But we were way up the years before under the neoliberal era. So in the case of Iceland, we have become more equal, and the wage gap has narrowed considerably, actually both through agreements, but mainly because of the actions taken in the tax system. Whereas the OECD also points out that most of the other economically troubled countries, like Ireland, Latvia, Greece, Portugal, Italy, Spain, the increase has become wider. So there are different routes to choose, and history proves that you have a choice. Now, regarding the banks a little bit, because we were supposed to comment on that, I think we have, after this very, very expensive experiment, we have learned a lot, at least how banking should not be executed in the world. I think we have to put very, very strict limits on banking expansion. It's always dangerous if the balance sheets of the banks start to explode, and be especially aware if there is cross-border banking involved through branches, as I said before. I think it's obvious that countries should be allowed to limit or restrict speculative capital movements to the extent these are allowed. I actually agree with Warren Buffett, who said that some of the new financial products are weapons of economical mass destruction. I think many of the products they very cleverly produced in the last 2 decades are always going to be harmful and should be eliminated and banned, such as the derivatives and many of the speculative products. Capital controls were introduced in Iceland, partly also in Cyprus, as you know, and we still have them because we have not been able to lift them without the risk of destabilizing the economy. And actually there's a relatively broad consensus on that Iceland had the right to do this and still do. The IMF has supported it, and the EFTA court has also ruled that Iceland is entitled to these safety measures. Now, of course, we would well be without them, but in my mind, we should reserve the right to at least have some speed limits and restrictions on speculative capital movements. I think it's absolutely necessary for small economies, not to mention if they have their own currency, to maintain that right. And why should we have a system that every now and then means that a country or an economy becomes a victim of the speculative carry trade? It is so outrageous to have a system like that, that it goes without saying. Now, how can we then get the economy and the financial sector in general under more democratic or social control? We were supposed to comment on that. Well, that is the million-dollar question. At least we know this much. It is catastrophic to allow it to be without control. We know that. We've been through that. We've taken that course. So what kind of controls can we introduce and what means can we use? Well, if you have a decently mixed economy, like we could say we have in the Nordic countries, at the best of the Nordic model, if you have a relatively strong public sector, if you have a cooperative sector, you have decent level of taxation and you have firm supervision and law enforcement, it's of course better. There's no doubt about that. But it's not enough, as the case in Iceland shows. We need very strong democratic control over these things, and we need to have legitimate and democratic mandate to do the necessary things. Of course, one of the grave problems of this all is the shift of power. The shift of power from elected representatives and democratic institutions to the market and to the capital owners. It's very simple. And how has this taken place? Well, through a very determined ideology with privatization, outsourcing, deregulation, weaker supervision, and so forth. Probably the biggest single factor in all this is the shift of power away from democratic electorate to the market and the capital. So we need to regain that power. with every possible means. Needless to say, of course, we did not privatize a single company in Iceland, but on the contrary, we, as in Slovenia, the state owns the biggest bank, as that had to be refinanced and rebuilt. We have been relatively successful regarding growth and turnaround in the economy. As for the last 3 years, we have an average economic growth of 2.5%. Unemployment has dropped from 9 to 4.5, and so forth. So at least we can show some impressive numbers, and we can argue that there are different ways of dealing with the crisis. There are different models. It's a matter of political choice, how you go about it. Now, as we are going to speak tonight, and I'm privileged to be also on a panel tonight where we are going to speak more about the left in government on the political role, I will refrain from that. I tried to stick to the topic of the panel as much as I could, but that will also be very exciting, and it drops down to many of the same issues, of course, that we have to deal with. I will talk about responsibility and sustainability tonight, as I think, and that will be my closing remarks, this is all very much about responsibility at the end of the day. Who are the responsible ones and who are the irresponsible ones? It's very, very easy to prove that the neoliberal, greed-driven models of the past 2-3 decades are the most irresponsible system ever introduced on this earth. It's about as far away from sustainability and social justice as anything can be. It is a ridiculous system, and sooner or later, of course, it will destroy itself. I think even though we in the left would do absolutely nothing and just sit back and wait, it would destroy itself, but it would destroy us all with it, and that's why we can't have it. Thank you.